When you think about the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game, there's honestly nothing more iconic than Exodia the Forbidden One. Everyone knows about the 5 pieces of Exodia ever since Yugi assembled it in the first episode and used it to obliterate Kaiba. Which is why it's a little bit odd to say, but Exodia has never really been competitively viable in the real-life card game. Except for the time where it actually OTK'd someone on stream at a 2000-man YCS, or the time where it actually got top 8 at the World Championships. Yes, this actually happened. Okay, so I guess there's a little bit more to it. When I say Exodia has never been truly competitively viable, it's a bit of a lie because this deck has been played at the highest levels and there are some rare occasions where it actually did well. So today we're going to do a deep dive into the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! And more specifically Exodia and the times that this deck was actually played. This of course started 23 years ago when the Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon, Yu-Gi-Oh!'s first ever set, was released containing all 5 pieces of Exodia. Yeah, they really made it easy for us overseas to get it, whereas in Japan you literally had to hunt for the 5 different pieces. They were all released during different times. Some were in booster packs, others were in game magazines as promos, and some were in specific promo packs that you could only get if you went to a very special event. But of course they were all ultra rare, and getting all the pieces as an 8-year-old back in the day was easier said than done. Another fun fact that you might have noticed is they actually censored the English versions of the Exodia cards. In the background they previously had a pentagram, but this had some religious connotations, so they decided to replace it with a spellbinding circle, which is also kind of interesting because this card itself was censored, but it was a card in Yugi's repertoire, so it's kind of nice they had some lore tie-ins with that censorship. Exodia was so powerful and unique that they had to write in the first ever rulebook that there existed an alternate win condition when a player assembled all 5 pieces of Exodia. And with it, on the very first Yu-Gi-Oh! Ban list, they restricted all 5 pieces to 1 copy per deck, because having 3 copies of the pieces would be a little too busted. Plus, lore-wise, no one had ever been able to assemble all 5 pieces of Exodia up until Yugi did it, apparently. Except for that one dude in Battle City that somehow had 3 copies of every Exodia piece. Now, this obviously made it nearly impossible to hard draw all 5 pieces of Exodia in your starting hand. In fact, somebody actually ran the calculations on Reddit and found that the odds of this happening was 1 in 658,008. But according to some legends floating around online, this has actually happened before. Now, the first rendition of the deck played basically every single stall card that was in the card pool. Cards like Swords of Revealing Light that prevented your opponent from attacking, and Wabaku that would prevent any battle damage dealt for a turn, and of course both Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest. These cards allowed you to search your deck for a specific monster when they were sent from the field to the graveyard. A monster with 1500 or less attack in the case of Sangan, or a monster with 1500 or less defense for Witch, which meant that seeing a copy of either of these cards was basically a missing piece of Exodia. Both of these cards happen to be dark types, so they themselves could be searched off of Mystic Tomato. And honestly, both Sangan and Witch were so busted, and eventually saw their own spot on the ban list, being banned at one point in time. Not because of Exodia, but more the fact that they were really generic and you could abuse them in basically every single deck. Stall-based variants of Exodia got better and better as new cards were released throughout time. Cards like Gravity Bind would prevent any level 4 or higher monsters from attacking, while Messenger of Peace prevented monsters with 1500 or more attack from attacking at the cost of 100 life points per standby phase. But the first semi-cohesive strategy for Exodia was released with the Pharaoh's Servant booster pack, which included the continuous trap card Appropriate. This card can be activated whenever your opponent draws a card outside of their draw phase, and whenever they draw cards outside of their draw phase, you get to draw 2 cards. It was initially regarded as trash by the rest of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community, but someone decided to try and make it a tool for Exodia, and thus gave birth to the Appropriate Exodia deck, a deck that relied on Appropriate as well as other cards that would force your opponent to draw cards, thereby triggering your own Appropriate to eventually draw your entire deck and into the 5 pieces of Exodia. Yeah, for some reason there were already cards that had some drawbacks which forced your opponent to draw. So cards like the Bistro Butcher, which whenever he dealt damage would force your opponent to draw 2 cards, or Hero Shadow Scout, which basically did the same thing when he was flipped over, both of which would allow you to draw 2 cards every time they triggered while Appropriate was on your side of the field. Over time, there were more and more cards that also got released, which allowed your opponent to draw a card. They straight up printed a card called Gift of Greed, which is just gifting your opponent a Pot of Greed. This trap card says your opponent draws 2 cards. At least someone knows what Pot of Greed does. Hand Destruction made both players discard 2 cards and then draw 2 more cards, and we also got some more stall cards like Threatening Roar and Thunder of Ruler, both of which were pseudo Wabakus that would skip your opponent's battle phase for the turn. Now, the only downside with Appropriate Exodia was the fact that, you're making your opponent draw cards along the way, which means they're also fueling their own hand with the best cards in their deck. And in games 2 and 3, where the opponent has access to their side deck and could sideboard in hate cards, especially for Exodia, Exodia, cards like Dust Tornado that destroys your spell or trap card, or even Royal Decree, which negates all trap cards on the field, allowing your opponent to draw more cards is more or less a ticking time bomb, which is why this deck was never really competitive. And it was the type of deck that you'd see on a rate/fixed thread somewhere on Pojo.com. Around the same time, both Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest were already on the ban list. You could only use one single copy of Sangan per deck, and Witch of the Black Forest was banned. But luckily for Exodia players, they actually released a card called Emissary of the Afterlife, which has an effect that triggers when he's sent from the field to the graveyard to search your deck for any normal monster. This is basically a watered down version of Sangan and Witch, so you can search for any of the limbs of Exodia, but not quite the head. Even still, it was a welcome addition to a lot of the existing Exodia decks at the time. There was another meme-worthy Exodia deck that spawned online. This deck would make usage of the continuous spell card called Heart of the Underdog, a card that says during the draw phase, when you draw a normal monster, you can reveal it to draw an additional card. And the key thing to know about this card is that it's not once per turn. So when you draw a normal monster for your draw phase, you can trigger the effect of Heart of the Underdog, and if you draw another normal monster off of that, you can then trigger it yet again to draw another normal monster, and so on and so forth until you draw a non-normal monster. But this deck was never super competitive for obvious reasons. When you play a deck full of vanilla monsters that don't do anything without effects, basically your deck does nothing without Heart of the Underdog, and if your opponent gets rid of it with one single MST, then you're probably in a pretty bad spot. And so for the next little bit, Exodia was just regarded as a joke deck, until somebody decided that there was potentially a way to beat the weaknesses of the existing Exodia decks by drawing all 5 pieces of Exodia in one single turn. This was actually made possible because the card pool had accumulated a vast number of powerful draw spells in addition to the monster card Royal Magical Library. This card allows you to accumulate a spell counter each time a spell card is activated, and by removing 3 spell counters, you can draw an additional card, and of course, this was not once per turn. So technically, by playing a deck that was full of turbo power draw spells that would replenish and replace each other, you could constantly cycle through your deck quickly with the help of Royal Magical Library until you literally draw your entire deck and inevitably assemble Exodia. And players realized that there was a mini dragon engine that could be incorporated in this strategy. Blue Eyes White Dragon could be searched off of the White Stone of Legend and then discarded off of cards like Dark World Dealings or Trade In, which requires a level 8 monster to be discarded. The White Stone of Legend was a level 1 Dragon Tuner, and that could be discarded off of cards of Consonance, which also allowed you to draw 2 cards, and then replace itself with a copy of Blue Eyes White Dragon. It also played other supplementary engines to thin the deck. Cards like Thunder Dragon would remove 2 cards from the deck, and Tune Table of Contents could search for itself and also fuel a spell counter for Royal Magical Library, and then eventually search for the Blue Eyes Toon Dragon, who was a level 8 monster to be discarded off of Trade-In. Upstart Goblin was of course a staple, allowing you to draw a card along the way, and some players even experimented with the Bamboo Swords. Golden Bamboo Sword would let you draw 2 cards while you controlled a broken Bamboo Sword, and so gave birth to what the community called the Deep Draw Dragon Exodia Turbo. Now the Dragon engine of course worked really well with the quick play spell card Super Rejuvenation, which would let you draw cards during your end phase equal to the amount of dragon monsters that were discarded this turn. So by drawing and discarding a bunch of Blue Eyes White Dragons and White Stone of Legends, in the end phase you could draw even more cards and assemble Exodia actually during the end phase of the turn. The best thing about Super Rejuvenation was that it was a quick play spell card, so you could draw into consecutive copies of Super Rejuvenation off itself, then activate the second copy of Rejuvenation and draw even more cards in order to finally draw Exodia. And the thing that made this deck particularly viable was the freshly released One Day of Peace. This card would let both players draw a card, but also prevented any damage from being dealt on the next turn, which would effectively save you for a turn while also drawing a card. It's basically Wabaku and Upstart Goblin rolled into one card, which was amazing for decks like this that wanted to stall. And a player by the name of Tyler Nolan, who was known for playing rogue strategies, and especially ones with solitaire-esque playstyles like Exodia, actually made day 2 of a YCS, as well as the North American World Championship qualifier in 2012, which had over 2,000 players. Unfortunately, he just fell short of making top cut with his deck, but it just goes to show that Exodia was really powerful. Ironically, one of the major weaknesses of the deck was the fact that the Exodia pieces were all duds. Drawing Exodia pieces in your opening hand basically meant you had to start playing with that less many cards, because the individual Exodia pieces did absolutely nothing on their own and didn't help facilitate the combo. Instead, you would want to see Royal Magical Library plus a bunch of spell cards, get the ball rolling, and eventually draw into the Exodia pieces for free off of cards like Super Rejuvenation, so they didn't conflict with the actual combo itself.
Hand Destruction, second counter, Exodia.
Now, this was, of course, before the time of powerful hand traps like Drone Lockbird or Ash Blossom that would stop the deck, so if you went first as an Exodia player, you were pretty much guaranteed to have a very high chance of winning. Apparently, the deck had a rumored win percentage of as high as 80% or more when going first.
It's always better to go second because you can't attack on your first turn. All right, fucking, that's great. What? Are you fucking kidding me?
But after numerous attempts of this deck actually trying to find success, it didn't pan out so well.
Say goodbye to Exodia!
That is until the Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship 2012, where Jarel Prowinston took an Exodia deck all the way to the top 8 of the world's strongest duelists.
You already know if it's not Pro, it got to go deuces.
Prowinston was a popular player and YouTuber at the time. This came entirely out of nowhere because the world's metagame was predominantly focused on Inzectors. Powerful TCG exclusives like Tour Guide from the Underworld, Wind Up Shark, and Evolzar Doka were all forbidden for the World Championship because they had not yet been released overseas in Japan. This left Inzectors as a sole viable strategy, being way stronger than any other deck in the format. It revolved around destroying cards on the field thanks to Inzector Hornet. And while the other American players tried to counter the metagame by bringing Gravekeepers and Chaos Dragons, none of them saw success except for Jarel, who decided to go against the grain and brought an Exodia deck. And this deck was especially teched out to counter the Inzector-filled meta. Instead of trying to draw Exodia in one single turn, which was seen as largely inconsistent and especially vulnerable, he decided to bring a trap-focused draw build that would accumulate the pieces over multiple turns. And this revolved mainly around the trap card Hope for Escape. This card allowed you to pay 1,000 life points and draw a card for every 2,000 life point differential between your life points and your opponent's. So by taking battle damage, but also increasing his opponent's life points with Gift Card, Hope for Escape could draw multiple cards. And on top of that, he played the full plethora of draw traps, including Reckless Greed, Jar of Greed, and Legacy of Yatagarasu, alongside 2 copies of Accumulated Fortune, which when activated as a Chain Link 4 or higher, allows you to draw 2 cards. The rest of the deck would play defensive stall cards like Wabaku and Threatening Roar, and of course, One Day of Peace. In the Swiss rounds, he was able to make a 3-2 record, barely sneaking into top 8 thanks to his good tiebreakers. But one particularly interesting fact about his tournament experience is that during the Swiss rounds, in round 3, he was actually paired against the Mexican player who was playing Six Samurai. Now, for those of you that don't know, Six Samurai heavily revolves around their legendary Six Samurai Shien alongside Naturia Beast, both of which can negate spell and trap cards. This meant basically an automatic lose for Jarel's Exodia deck, but luckily for him, and well, unfortunately for his opponent, they had an emergency medical incident and had to be rushed to the hospital just before their match started. This allowed Jarel to get a free bye during the Swiss rounds, and with his good tiebreakers was just enough for him to sneak in the top 8, where he was swiftly vanquished by a Japanese Inzector player who had since adapted to his Exodia-based strategy by not attacking Jarel early on, and also using Solemn Warning on his own cards in order to pay his life points lower.
I'm not sure I've ever seen somebody use Solemn Warning on his own summon before.
This way, Jarel's Hope for Escape cards were completely dead, and left with no way to draw consistently, he would ultimately lose in Game 3. But at the time, this was a crazy thing that Exodia finally did well at a premier event and at the highest level of competitive play at the World Championships to boot. But unfortunately, the World Championship used a specific format that was different from the others because it combined both the ban lists of the TCG and the OCG. This meant that despite Jarel's success, the deck wouldn't see any competitive play outside of that event. And for almost the next decade, Exodia decks pretty much remained dormant from the format because the power creep was just so crazy that stall decks had no way to compete. That was until May 3rd, 2019, when Konami released the card called Mystic Mine. This was a card that was highly controversial and over the course of the next few years plagued the game. Mystic Mine is a field spell that says, while your opponent controls more monsters than you, they cannot activate any monster effects, nor can they declare any attacks with monsters. This was basically the penultimate stall card. Not only did it shut off any problematic monster effects, which by then had dictated the game, but it also prevented any battle damage from being dealt, which meant your opponent just couldn't win the game. But this card was especially toxic because no one main decked any outs to it. Cards like Mystical Space Typhoon and Cosmic Cyclone were great in theory, however, by then, the majority of decks were revolving around monster effects, and while back row removal could deal with problematic spells and traps, it did not deal with the core problem in the metagame, which was the monsters. And so in light of this, this, certain players decided to take the advantage and build Mystic Mine decks with the sole purpose of winning through stall. The main win condition with Mystic Mine was typically decking your opponent out. If you played more than 40 cards, then your opponent would inevitably draw their entire deck, and having no answers means that they will be the first to deck out and lose. But there were also other flavors of Mystic Mine that incorporated win conditions like slow burn, and of course Exodia, being the first ever stall deck that was so iconic. On top of that, Mystic Mine players could also play Field Barrier, which was a way to protect the Mystic Mine, and powerful counter trap cards like Solemn Judgment or Dark Bribe to negate any possible answers to the Mystic Mine. And as long as Mystic Mine stayed on the table, it basically meant that player was going to win. Mystic Mine Exodia would incorporate ways to search the field spell as well, cards like Terraforming, but also Demise of the Land, which was a quick play that allowed you to activate Mystic Mine directly from your deck when your opponent special summoned a monster, as well as cards like Metaverse, which is basically a trap version of Terraforming. This meant that you had multiple ways to search for Mystic Mine on top of powerful consistency cards like Upstart Goblin or Pot of Duality, and as long as you had a way to protect Mystic Mine, you would inevitably draw the 5 pieces of Exodia. The card would typically create game states that were completely stalled and would involve nothing happening for multiple turns. This got so bad that they eventually did have to ban the card, although it took a little longer than the Yu-Gi-Oh community would have liked. But arguably the most well-known Mystic Mine player was none other than an older player named Leonard. Jeff was notorious for actually bringing the Mystic Mine deck to a plethora of events and pissing off his opponents.
So Field Barrier is an extremely old card. It says any field spells in the field zone can't be destroyed. So Mystic Mine doesn't die by its own effect at the end of the turn.
This resulted in a bunch of different memes circulating through the Yu-Gi-Oh community and led to a lot of hilarity. But when the Mystic Mine strategy was finally banned, Jeff didn't give up. He decided to pivot his strategy towards something that could piss people off equally, and that was Exodia. But there was just one issue with this. Modern Yu-Gi-Oh completely revolves around hand traps, monsters that you can discard from your hand during your opponent's turn in order to stop a card effect or to impose a condition on the game state. Cards like Drone Lockbird and Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring completely shut down draw-based decks like Exodia, so that was the first hurdle. The other hurdle is the fact that a lot of decks put up a bunch of disruptions, whether that be Omni Negates that can negate card effects, or even play cards like Solemn Judgment that straight up counter a card. So with those two hurdles, Jeff basically decided that he had to build an Exodia deck that would, number one, win in one single turn, much like how the Deep Draw Dragon Exodia Turbo deck functioned, and also play in a way that beats hand traps. And so he took the previous iterations of Exodia and adapted them in a way that allowed him to abuse a couple of different engines that existed in the game, all with the sole purpose of looping a single card called Blue Dragon Summoner. Much like Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest, when this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, you can search your deck for a copy of a normal spellcaster monster, which basically means all 4 of the Exodia limbs. And it turns out that this card is actually not once per turn either, so you could loop it continuously by resurrecting it from the graveyard over and over again with a powerful link monster called Selene, Queen of the Master Magicians. By removing 3 spell counters from Selene, you could resurrect any spellcaster monster from your graveyard in defense mode. And because Selene's not once per turn, you could loop 3 copies of Selene in your extra deck to search 3 times by bringing back Blue Dragon Summoner over and over and over again and linking it off along the way. This instantly lets you search for the 4 Exodia limbs. But that left a bit of a problem because the head of Exodia was not a normal monster, so how on earth would you search this? Well, it turns out there's an Xyz monster called Time Star Magician that can detach a material from itself to search your deck for any dark spellcaster monster and add it to your hand. And the best part is Time Star Magician actually had a secondary effect that allows you to send the Blue Dragon Summoner from your deck to your graveyard. So there's definitely some cohesion here and everything was slowly coming together. To have enough resources to continuously make Selene's, the deck also played a Pendulum engine to spam a bunch of monsters onto the board at once. The Pendulum engine could easily be bridged into off of a sold 2 Tales of Noble Knights. This was another powerful link monster that required 2 warriors to make. And the Neospatian Connector engine was perfect for this. When this card is normal summoned, you can special summon out the Neospatian Aqua Dolphin, a monster that also lets you look at your opponent's hand and rip out a potential hand trap that would stop you further in the combo. This was amazing because not only are you going into sold to resolve your combo, but you're also getting rid of any disruptions along the way. And by making Isolde, you can summon out a copy of your Ignoble Knight Renaud to search for a copy of Ignis Phoenix, which was a Pendulum monster that worked really well with the Ignite monsters. And by looping the Pendulum monsters over and over, you can combine them to make the Time Star Magician, search a copy of Exodia's head, dump the Blue Dragon Summoner, and have enough materials to churn and summon through Cross Sheep and 3 copies of Selene in order to bring back Blue Dragon Summoner 4 times and complete all 5 pieces of Exodia. Not only was Jeff able to construct this deck, but he also took it to a YCS tournament of over 2,000 players and won on a feature match against a player playing Tearlaments, which was one of the best decks at the time.
Just in case, we're going to go into Appaloosa at the end of this.
This is clean. This is very clean. We got the other arm, and all 5 pieces have been assembled. The legs, the arms, the head. Exodia Obliterate.
He accomplished such an iconic feat that this transcended just the Yu-Gi-Oh community. In fact, the entirety of the front page of both Twitter, Reddit, and every social media out there was talking about Jeff Leonard and his Exodia OTK. He was the first player to do it live on stream and be recorded forever into the history of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh as the one player who was able to assemble all 5 pieces of Exodia. Unfortunately, he later lost out in the next couple of rounds because at the end of the day, Exodia is just not nearly as consistent, especially through all of the disruptions and the hand traps that the game's power creep has led us to. And after that, Exodia basically fell into slumber yet again without it seeing any success. That is until 2024, when Infinite Forbidden actually released a set of support for Exodia. But this support was completely different than the deck's traditional playstyle of trying to assemble the 5 pieces. Instead, it focused on the unstoppable Exodia Incarnate, a fusion summon of the 5 Exodia pieces. Yes, literally the big Darkly Rabbi counterfeit card that you had as a kid was now an actual card. And this card could negate any spell or trap card once per turn, as well as gain attack equal to your life points, which was a bit of a callback to the lore in the anime where it's summoned to fight Dark Master Zork, and was based on Grandpa's life force energy. The card itself could also set a copy of Exiled Fires of Rage, which destroys your opponent's entire field, or Obliterate Blaze, which would let you equip all 5 pieces of Exodia to the fusion monster and then gain 10,000 attack. Now you might be wondering, why the heck would you fusion summon for the unstoppable Exodia when you already have the 5 pieces in your hand? Well, it turns out they actually printed a card called Millennium Ankh, which lets you fusion summon for the unstoppable Exodia Incarnate by revealing the pieces from your hand, your field, or your deck. There were also a bunch of retrains of existing Millennium monsters, cards like the Millennium Golem, Millennium Shield, and Sengenjin, all of who were somehow tied to the Egyptian lore, were all remodeled as powerful cards that allowed you to search for the respective pieces to assemble the Exodia Incarnate. Surprisingly, they also received a monster called the Heart of Blue Eyes. This is presumably Grandpa's Blue Eyes White Dragon that Kaiba rips up in the first episode of the anime, and it can actually search for the Millennium Ankh, giving the deck even more consistency. And so the modern Exodia deck went from drawing and assembling the cards in one turn to a control variant that spat out a powerful fusion monster who can negate cards and could one-shot your opponent on the consecutive turn with over 8,000 damage. The deck actually did quite well in some regional tournaments, seeing success in tops here and there, and even made top 16 of a remote duel YCS tournament that had some of the best players at the time attending. And this was probably the most competitive Exodia has ever been in the history of the entire game. But honestly, I was hoping that there would be some kind of alternative win condition that still capitalized on assembling the pieces. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the different Exodia variants across the entire timeline of the game. Was there a particular playstyle that stuck out? And has anyone out there actually assembled the 5 pieces of Exodia in a competitive tournament?